At the charity gala, Joanne laughed, a sound too bright, leaning into Arthur Jensen as his hand lingered on her lower back. The room full of polite chatter suddenly focused on me, a freeze frame of shared recognition. He caught my eye across the polished floor, a faint, insolent smirk playing on his lips, before turning back to her with a possessive whisper. Calvin Miller felt a chill settle deep in his bones, a cold tremor that had nothing to do with the early November air pressing against the Portland windows. He stood in the bedroom, the morning light thin and gray, holding a silk scarf. It was an Hermes, he recognized the signature pattern, but it was not Joe's style. Her taste ran to practical elegance, muted colors. This scarf was a vibrant fuchsia, bold and frankly, a bit ostentatious for her. He had found it tucked beneath a stack of sweaters in her bottom dresser drawer, a place she rarely used. A faint, sweet scent clung to the silk, a perfume he didn't recognize, expensive and foreign to the familiar aromas of their home. He ran a thumb over the fine fabric, the silk cool against his skin. 15 years they had built this life, a quiet understanding forming the bedrock of their marriage. Their conversations were often brief, filled with the comfortable shorthand of long-term partnership. He was a medical attorney, navigating the complex waters of malpractice suits and hospital regulations. Joanne, his wife, was a nurse, steady and meticulous, working for Dr. Arthur Jensen at Westwood Medical. Jensen was a local legend, a cardiac surgeon with hands of gold and a reputation that glittered like polished brass in the city's professional circles. In recent months, however, their predictable rhythm had begun to falter. Joanne had started coming home with what she called gifts from grateful patients. First, it was an expensive bottle of wine, then a small, delicate gold bracelet. Last week, it had been a pair of exclusive tickets to a symphony gala, an event she knew he never particularly enjoyed. Her explanations, delivered with a quick smile and a slight dart of her eyes, felt thin, like worn-out fabric. "Just so generous, Cal," she'd say, placing the item on the kitchen counter, her tone a little too bright. He had started to notice other things. Her shifts grew longer, stretching into the late evenings. Her phone, once left on the charger in the hallway, now remained glued to her hand, often face down. When he asked about work, about her day, a nervous edge would creep into her voice, a subtle tension around her mouth. She attributed it to a demanding new caseload, the pressures of the hospital. He had accepted her words then, a willing participant in the illusion of their stability. One night, the silence in their bedroom stretched, heavy and still. Joanne lay beside him, her breathing even and deep, lost to sleep. The illuminated clock read 2:17 a.m. He stared at the ceiling, the chill from the scar discovery returning with a vengeance. He knew with a certainty that settled in his gut what he had to do. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for her phone on the nightstand. He unlocked it with her usual passcode, a familiar sequence he hadn't used in years. His fingers moved with a practiced ease, opening her messages. There it was, a thread with Art J. Dozens of messages dating back months. His breath hitched, a silent, painful constriction in his chest. "Gorgeous today," one read, sent last Tuesday during his deposition. "Napa trip details are set for next month," another said, accompanied by a winking emoji. Then a message from only a few days prior. "This bracelet is as beautiful as you." He looked at the gold chain glinting on her dresser. He scrolled further, the digital conversation unspooling a pattern of flirtation that bordered on explicit. It was not just Jensen's overtures, it was Joanne's responses, her lack of resistance, the subtle encouragement embedded in her replies. She hadn't stopped it. She had participated, allowed it to bloom. His first instinct, raw and visceral, was to shake her awake, to demand an explanation, to confront the ugly truth. But then the lawyer's mind, cold and calculating, asserted itself. Jensen, Dr. Arthur Jensen. A public confrontation would not only shatter their marriage, it could ruin Joanne professionally. It could taint his own reputation, his firm. Jensen was too powerful, too well connected. He had influence, and Cal knew the medical community in Portland was a small, interconnected web. Lying while there, the weight of the betrayal pressing down, Cal resolved on a different path. This pompous doctor thought he could take his wife, slip into their life without consequence. Cal would take everything from him instead. He would not scream. He would not rage. He would be methodical. His eyes, now wide open in the dark, stared at the sleeping form beside him. A slow, strategic takedown began to form in the quiet recesses of his mind. He would dig deeper, using every shred of his knowledge of the medical system to find Jensen's vulnerabilities, to unearth the hidden faults beneath the polished surface. It was at the annual hospital gala under the sparkling chandeliers. I watched Dr. Jensen's hand linger too long on Joanne's back as they laughed, his eyes possessive. My own wife, right there. He caught my gaze from across the room, a smirk playing on his lips, and offered a casual, almost mocking nod before turning back to her. A cold weight settled in my chest, a certainty forming. A chill, a deep, unsettling cold, had settled in my bones the night of the gala. It hadn't left since. Portland's damp air usually penetrated the skin, but this was different. This cold started inside and worked its way out. I was Calvin Miller, a medical attorney who dealt in facts, in evidence, in the precise application of law. Emotions rarely entered my professional space, and they were supposed to stay out of my home too. The physical evidence first surfaced in Joanne's dresser drawer, tucked beneath her sensible cotton shirts. It was a silk scarf, Hermes, the kind with intricate equestrian prints. I knew Joanne's style. Practical, functional. This scarf was neither. It smelled of a foreign perfume, something expensive, heavy, not the light floral scent she usually wore. It was a scent that didn't belong in our quiet 15-year-old home, not in her drawer. Our marriage had been built on quiet understanding, a steady current beneath the surface of daily life. We met at the courthouse, her a witness in a minor malpractice suit, me prosecuting. We weren't given to grand gestures. We didn't need them, or so I had believed. Joanne was a dedicated nurse at Westwood Medical, a big institution in town. She worked for Dr. Arthur Jensen, a cardiac surgeon. Jensen was a local legend, revered, admired, a man whose name was synonymous with innovation and influence. I knew his type from my work. Powerful men, accustomed to getting what they wanted. In the past few months, the gifts had started appearing. First, a rare bottle of Cabernet, purportedly from a grateful patient. Then, a delicate gold bracelet, a thank you for excellent care. Most recently, a pair of tickets to an exclusive gallery opening, the kind that required connections more than cash. Joanne offered her explanations with a quick smile, a dismissive wave of the hand. Her excuses sounded thin, like cheap fabric stretched over something too large to hide. I started noticing other things, longer shifts explained by unforeseen complications or emergency surgery. Her phone, once left casually on the counter, was now almost always in her hand, face down or tucked securely in her pocket. When I'd ask about her day, about work, her answers became clipped, her movements a little quicker. A nervous edge to her voice I hadn't heard before. She'd say things were fine, just busy. The details had gone missing. One Tuesday night, the house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Joanne had been asleep for an hour, a steady breath lifting the sheet. My own heart beat a rhythm against the mattress. I reached for her phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up with a pattern lock. I knew her patterns. A square, a line, a curve. The small screen glowed, illuminating my face in the dark room. My thumb hovered. Then I pressed the sequence. The messages were there, an undeniable stream from Art J. They weren't discreet. Gorgeous today, read one, time-stamped from just last week. Another, concerning the bracelet. This bracelet is as beautiful as you. Wear it for me. There was talk of a Napa trip, mentioned casually, as if it were a shared secret. My gut tightened. The words were a pattern of flirtation, a professional line crossed, bordering on explicit, and Joanne hadn't stopped it. She hadn't just received them, she had responded. My first instinct was raw, to wake her, to confront her, to yell until the walls shook. But my lawyer's mind, always analytical, always calculating consequences, kicked in. Arthur Jensen wasn't just a doctor. He was a force. A whisper from him could ruin Joanne's career, and in turn, mine. This wasn't a domestic squabble. This was a chess match, And I had just discovered I was several moves behind. I decided on a different path, a methodical one, a slow, precise demolition. This pompous doctor thought he could take my wife. I would take everything from him instead. His reputation, his practice, his carefully constructed life. I lay there next to my sleeping wife, her breathing even, unaware of the war that had just begun. The plan started to form, slow and strategic. I would dig deeper. I knew the medical system, its regulations, its vulnerabilities. Jensen had power, but even powerful men left tracks. I would find them. I would use my knowledge of the system to dismantle him, piece by careful piece. Calvin started his investigation the next morning, the betrayal a cold, hard knot in his stomach that fueled a singular focus. He leaned on his professional network, the quiet web of contacts he'd built over 2 decades in medical law. His target, Dr. Arthur Jensen's practice at Westwood Medical. The clinic was renowned for its profitability. A local jewel in the city's healthcare crown, a fact he now viewed with deep suspicion. He spent hours poring over publicly available data, insurance payout statistics, and healthcare expenditure reports. The numbers told a story that was, on the surface, impressive. Westwood Medical's reimbursements for surgical procedures, particularly joint replacements, were consistently 64% higher than the state average. This figure, initially a point of pride for the hospital, now flagged itself in Cal's mind like a red alert. He paid particular attention to the bills associated with fully insured patients over the age of 50. The demographic made sense for joint surgeries, but the sheer volume and the higher payouts raised a silent alarm. He knew direct access to patient information was impossible, protected by stringent HIPAA laws. A lawyer, even one with a justifiable grievance, couldn't just walk in and demand files. He needed a subtler approach, a way to peer behind the curtain without alerting anyone, least of all Jensen. He dialed Dale's number. Dale Peterson, a former colleague from his early days at the firm, now held a senior position at the state's Healthcare Quality Authority. "Dale, old friend," Cal began, his voice smooth and easy. "I'm working on a paper looking at trends in surgical outcomes for a conference presentation. Thought you might have some insights." The academic research angle was plausible, a common enough request among legal professionals. Dale was happy to talk, his voice a familiar, amiable rumble. "Westwood, huh? Jensen's practice?" He chuckled. "They're a gold mine, always top of the heap in terms of volume." Cal listened, his pen poised over a legal pad, feigning casual interest. Dale confirmed his growing suspicions. "We've noticed a trend here, Cal," Dale said, his tone shifting slightly. "Westwood performs an abnormally high number of joint surgeries, especially on Medicare patients. The volume is, well, staggering. These numbers are statistical outliers for sure." Cal's grip tightened on his pen. "Statistical outliers," he repeated, letting the phrase hang in the air. "But I imagine Jensen's documentation is impeccable, given his reputation." "Oh, absolutely," Dale affirmed. "His outcome documentation is always impeccable. The recovery rates, patient satisfaction scores, everything's by the book. He's a machine. You'd think he invented the perfect knee." Cal paused, then pushed a little further, keeping his voice light. "And patient complaints? For such a high volume, you'd expect some, wouldn't you?" "That's the strange part, Cal," Dale confessed, a note of genuine bewilderment in his voice. "Almost none. We get almost no official complaints against Jensen or Westwood for these procedures. Either he's a miracle worker, or the complaints never make it to your office, or mine for that matter." Cal's mind clicked. "Never make it to your office," he echoed, a quiet revelation dawning. "Any thoughts on why that might be?" Dale hesitated, then lowered his voice slightly. "Well, you know Jensen's connected. His brother-in-law sits on the hospital board, and his wife's family practically built half the city. It's not unheard of for certain issues to get handled in-house, if you catch my meaning, before they ever become official." He caught his meaning all right. The complaints weren't disappearing. They were being intercepted, contained, managed before they could become public record or a problem for Jensen. The meticulous documentation, the impeccable outcomes, it was all part of a carefully constructed facade. Cal ended the call, thanking Dale for his academic insights. He knew what he had to do next. He needed to get closer to the source, bypass the official channels, and listen to the whispers on the ground. Over the next few weeks, Cal started frequenting a couple of bars and coffee shops near Westwood Medical, places where he knew the staff unwound after their shifts. He'd arrive around 5, nurse a whiskey or a coffee, and casually strike up conversations. "My wife, Joanne, she's a nurse over at Westwood," he'd offer, a friendly, familiar face. "Works with Dr. Jensen. Hard worker, that woman." He posed as a concerned husband, a friend of the staff, his quiet demeanor inviting trust. Slowly, carefully, the snippets of information started to trickle in. He heard whispers, hushed tones over cheap beer. Not about the affair yet, not directly, but about Jensen. "He's obsessed with his numbers," one weary nurse muttered into her pint glass. "Always talking about his successful operation statistics, even if the patient's still hobbling 2 months later." Another administrative assistant, after her third glass of wine, confided, "He pushes for surgery. You see it, the way he talks to patients, it's always surgical intervention is your best option." Always. The picture began to clarify, piece by careful piece. Jensen wasn't just a good surgeon, he was a driven man, perhaps too driven, with an uncanny ability to control the narrative around his practice. And it seemed control extended to more than just patient outcomes. The bar at the old church was dimly lit, the clinking of glasses and low hum of conversation, a perfect cover. I leaned back in my chair, nursing a bourbon, listening more than talking. My ears, trained for courtroom whispers, picked up fragments from the table next to me. A receptionist, 2 martinis deep, was talking shop. "Dr. Jensen, he just loves his successful operation statistics. You know," she slurred a little, gesturing with a manicured hand. "Always about the number of procedures performed, percentage of successful outcomes. He demands the figures increase every month, every single month." She took another sip. "Especially loves operating on elderly patients with good insurance," she added with a cynical chuckle, a sound that grated in the already thick air. The phrase hung there, a small dark seed. Later, I managed to maneuver closer to a different group, catching the eye of a nurse from administrative who had worked with Jensen for years. "Sometimes, I swear, we do twice as many diagnostic procedures as other clinics," she confided, her voice low. "Dr. Jensen calls it thorough diagnostics, but sometimes it just seems like we're padding bills, just trying to find something." She shrugged, a weary expression on her face. Her words were spoken without malice, just a tired acceptance of the system. The third night I found my mark. Brenda, a medical assistant, sat alone at the bar, swirling the ice in her empty gin and tonic. Her hair was pulled back tightly, but stray wisps framed a tired face. She looked like she'd had a long week. I bought her another drink. After a few more sips, her inhibitions loosened. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Between us," Brenda began, her breath warm with alcohol, "I've seen Wilson change diagnostic results. I mean, a patient comes in with minor joint pain, just needs some physical therapy maybe. Somehow, they leave with 3 scheduled surgeries." She laughed nervously, a high-pitched sound. "Dr. Jensen, he's a miracle worker, you know? He finds problems no other doctor can see." I feigned concern, my brow furrowing just enough. "That sounds concerning, Brenda. Is that even ethical?" She waved her hand dismissively, spilling a drop of gin on the polished wood. "Ethical? Look, it's brilliant. The clinic's bonuses are all tied to procedure volume. We're all getting rich, Cal. The staff, the nurses, even the receptionists get a cut. Nobody asks too many questions." Her eyes, though a little glazed, held a defiant glint. "But how does he bypass insurance reviews?" I pressed gently, my voice calm, almost casual. "Insurance companies have pretty strict verification processes for surgeries, especially multiple ones." Brenda leaned in closer, her whisper now a slurred secret. "He's got this system where he documents subtle findings, calls them Wilson's markers. Little anomalies on scans, slight changes in blood work that aren't quite diseases yet, but could be. Vague enough, impossible to disprove really. He's got his own imaging technicians too. Guys who know exactly what to highlight, Where to look? She took a gulp of her drink. They're very good at their jobs. Then she dropped another pearl. And there's this rumor, I don't know if it's true, but they say Jensen's brother-in-law works at Blue Shield's review department. You know, the big insurance company? Might explain why things slide through so easy sometimes. The revelation felt like a cold stone in my stomach. A family connection in the review department. It tied everything together. What about patient complaints? I asked, pushing the edge of my glass across the wet coaster. Surely if patients are getting unnecessary surgeries, there are complaints. Brenda's expression darkened. The tipsy cheer vanished, replaced by a grim set to her jaw. Oh, those disappear, literally. She looked around as if the walls might be listening. There's a special protocol for any complaint against Dr. Jensen. They don't go into the normal system. They go directly to Carol in patient relations. Carol's his loyal gatekeeper, been with him 15 years. She makes sure they just vanish. She went on, describing how Jensen himself would personally call persistent patients. Starts off real compassionate, you know. I understand your concerns, Mrs. Johnson. All very calm. Then he gradually introduces doubt about their memory or their understanding of the complex medical procedures. Makes them question themselves. You'd be surprised how many just back down. She shuddered and took another drink, as if to wash away the memory. Calvin knew the bar talk, the whispers, were only circumstantial. He needed something concrete, something that could hold up in court, something beyond the hazy recollections of disgruntled nurses. He needed numbers, specific patterns, verifiable data. This was a legal fight, not just a moral one. He reached out to Gary Jenkins, an old client and a friend, a man he'd helped navigate a difficult property dispute years ago. Gary was now a senior analyst at Sterling Health, one of the largest insurance companies in the Pacific Northwest, covering a substantial number of Westwood Medical's patients. They arranged a quiet lunch at a small Italian place downtown, far from the prying eyes of their respective offices. Over plates of pasta and hushed conversation, Cal laid out his academic research premise, a familiar tune by now. Gary listened, his expression guarded, then leaned forward. Cal, this is confidential, Gary began, his voice barely a whisper, but we've been tracking Jensen's clinic for several months ourselves. Off book, of course. Cal felt a jolt of grim satisfaction. He was on the right track. And what have you found? Gary shifted, picking at a loose thread on his napkin. Statistically, he's got too many procedures per patient, especially for people over 50. For his demographic, the readmissions, the follow-up surgeries, it just doesn't add up to what a normal, ethical practice should be seeing. He sighed. But Jensen, he's so respected. The miracle worker of cardiac and joint surgery. Nobody dares question it officially. Calvin pressed. Specifically, what kind of procedures? Knee arthroscopic surgeries are a big one, Gary stated, his eyes meeting Cal's. He performs them twice as often as the average orthopedic surgeon in the state. And here's the kicker. His complication rate for those specific procedures is demonstrably higher. Not by a lot, but enough to flag it. More follow-up pain, longer recovery times, more patients needing a second procedure a year or two later. Why hasn't your company investigated further? Cal asked. The question sharp, though his tone remained even. Gary let out a short, humorless laugh. Politics, Cal, pure and simple. Jensen sits on multiple hospital boards. He's a major donor to the city's arts foundation. He plays golf with our CEO every other weekend. His name carries weight. Too much weight, apparently. So, his paperwork, Cal surmised, it's all pristine? Technically, yes, Gary confirmed. All his documentation, his billing codes, the medical necessity justifications, immaculate. We'd need overwhelming evidence to move on this. Something beyond our internal algorithms flagging an anomaly. What would overwhelming evidence entail? Cal asked, already mapping out the path ahead. Patient testimonies, for starters, Gary listed, ticking them off on his fingers. A documented pattern of unnecessary procedures where the patient was genuinely harmed. Proof that his initial diagnoses were fabricated or exaggerated, where the MRI didn't match the operative report, for example. We'd need something concrete that showed intent, not just bad luck or aggressive treatment. Gary paused, then leaned back, a bitter expression on his face. We actually tried something similar 2 years ago. A mid-level executive started poking around. He was suddenly transferred to our Alaska office within weeks for a promising new opportunity or some such nonsense. The message was clear. Jensen is untouchable, at least to us. The silence hung between them, heavy with the weight of corporate complicity and professional fear. Cal understood. He wasn't asking Gary to go to war for him. He just needed data. He needed a weapon. "Could you provide me with anonymized data?" Cal asked, returning to his familiar academic pretense. "Just for my research paper, of course." 3 years of his clinic's aggregated surgical data focused on those particular procedures? Gary hesitated for a long moment, weighing the risk. "Anonymized, you said? No patient identifiers?" "Completely anonymized," Cal assured him. "I just need the numbers, the types of procedures, the general demographics, and the payout codes. Nothing that could link back to a specific person." "Let me see what I can do," Gary finally conceded. "It might take a week or so to scrub it properly." A week later, a thick encrypted file landed in Cal's inbox. 3 years of data. He spent days immersed in spreadsheets, cross-referencing, charting. What stared back at him was a disturbing pattern, a clear correlation between a patient's insurance type, whether they had private, high reimbursement plans, or Medicare, and the number of aggressive, often redundant, procedures prescribed. It was all there, in black and white and green. Jensen wasn't just doing more procedures. He was targeting specific patients who had the best coverage. But it wasn't enough. The data was damning, yes, but it was still just numbers. He needed real cases. He needed real people, with real pain and real stories. He needed victims. That's when luck, or perhaps a cruel twist of fate, intervened. The greens at the Waverly Country Club were meticulously manicured, a verdant contrast to the growing ugliness of my investigation. I was playing a solitary round, ostensibly for relaxation, but truly for observation. That's when I casually met Gene Peterson, a 62-year-old former English professor, struggling slightly with his swing. His movements were stiff, punctuated by grunts of discomfort. "Tough out there today, isn't it?" I offered, retrieving my ball from the cup. Gene sighed, leaning on his putter. "The course is fine. It's these knees. Had them both done last year. Minor discomfort, they said. Now I'm in more pain than before." He shook his head, a look of weary skepticism settling on his face. "Sometimes I wonder if they were even necessary. Just a slight ache, nothing major." I introduced myself, extending a hand. "Calvin Miller, medical attorney." I kept my tone even, neutral. I hear a lot of stories like that in my line of work. Gene's eyes brightened slightly. "Oh, you do? Well, it was Dr. Arthur Jensen over at Westwood. Heard he was the best, a real miracle worker." The words hung in the air, echoing the medical assistant Brenda's earlier sarcastic remark. "Jensen, you say?" I asked, as if the name meant nothing more than any other. "What was his approach?" Gene recounted the experience, a familiar narrative already forming in my mind. "He was very persuasive, said my cartilage was thinning, that the Wilson's markers on the MRI indicated severe deterioration, even if I wasn't feeling it yet. Emphasized potential future problems, the importance of getting ahead of it, despite my minimal current symptoms." Gene winced as he shifted his weight, said it would only get worse. I trusted him. He then described the pre-op process, which resonated with the earlier whispers. "They were so quick, barely examined me, just a quick look, just scanned and said, 'Let's fix it before it gets worse.' Felt like I was on a conveyor belt. One minute I'm complaining about a little stiffness, the next I'm scheduled for 2 major surgeries. I sensed it immediately, a potential victim. Gene was articulate, credible, and clearly felt wronged. I offered my card. "If you ever feel like you were misled, Gene, or if you want someone to review your case, my door's always open. Pro bono, of course. Sometimes a second look can provide clarity." I didn't reveal my true motive, didn't mention Jensen or the depth of my investigation. Not yet. Back in my office, the air conditioning too cold, I began meticulously cross-referencing Gene's anonymized data, provided by Gary, with the pattern I'd already started to observe. The pieces clicked into place. Gene's age, his Medicare status, the vague Wilson's markers diagnosis, the push for 2 surgeries on minor symptoms. It was all there, but I identified a disturbing pattern. Other Medicare patients over 50, all with similar Wilson's markers diagnoses, all leading to multiple seemingly unnecessary surgeries for joint pain that had initially been reported as minor. It wasn't just an outlier, it was a playbook. The time for quiet investigation was over. I needed to find more genes. I developed a targeted approach, leveraging my professional network once again, but this time with a more overt, if still masked, purpose. I started visiting senior centers and community groups, offering pro bono advice on elder care, estate planning, and navigating the complexities of healthcare. It was a perfect cover, a way to meet potential victims without raising red flags. Just giving back to the community, I'd tell organizers. My voice sincere. The stories started to pour in. Mrs. Henderson, 78, had a hip replacement for early-stage deterioration and now walked with a cane, still in pain. Mr. Davies, 72, 2 shoulder surgeries within 6 months, told by Jensen it was preventative. Each story was a variation on genes, a narrative of minor symptoms escalating into multiple, expensive procedures, all performed by Dr. Arthur Jensen. I compiled a list of a dozen names, each story strikingly similar to genes. The whispers of Brenda and the administrative nurse were no longer just whispers, they were corroborated evidence. The clinic's bonuses, the high procedure volume, the Wilson's markers, it all pointed to a deliberate, systematic scheme of medical fraud and battery. As I began drafting a legal strategy, the words formed themselves on the page. Class action suit. It could be devastating, not just for Jensen, but for Westwood Medical, for all those complicit in the scheme. This wasn't just about my wife anymore. This was about justice. The choices we make, the paths we walk, they all have a price. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. Calvin began meeting individually with the patients he had identified, arranging discreet appointments in his office or in neutral public places. He kept his language simple, eschewing legal jargon, focusing instead on their experiences, on how they felt after their surgeries. He wasn't there to accuse them, but to open their eyes to a possibility, to let them connect the dots he had already laid out. One patient, Martha Hayes, a retired school teacher with kind eyes and a slow gait, sat across from him in his office. Her hands, gnarled with age, fidgeted with a tissue. She had undergone 2 hip surgeries under Jensen's care within 3 years, both supposedly essential and life-changing. Now her pain was worse, a constant ache that stole her sleep and her ability to walk her dog more than a block. "I just wanted to enjoy my retirement, Mr. Miller," she whispered, tears tracing lines through the powder on her cheeks. "Travel a little, see my grandkids more. Now I can barely get out of bed some mornings. He told me it would fix everything." He promised. Her voice cracked, and she openly wept, recounting her increased pain, her shattered hopes. Calvin listened, his expression unwavering, his own anger a cold, steady flame. These were not just numbers anymore. These were lives, tangible consequences of Jensen's greed. He secured signed affidavits from Martha and 5 other patients, each detailing their initial diagnoses, the treatments they received, and the painful post-operative complications that had turned their golden years into a constant struggle. He meticulously gathered their entire medical records, cross-referencing them with the insurance claims and any communication logs they had with Jensen's clinic. The patterns emerged with stark clarity. Fabricated or exaggerated diagnoses jumped off the pages, a twisted echo of Brenda's earlier whispers about Wilson's markers. He saw instances where mild degenerative changes were blown into urgent surgical necessities, where physical therapy was bypassed entirely in favor of the knife. He also uncovered specific instances where Carol, Jensen's loyal gatekeeper in patient relations, had suppressed complaints. He found letters from distraught patients seeking answers or redress, which were never officially logged, never forwarded to the proper regulatory bodies. Instead, they were met with form letters dismissing their concerns, or worse, a personal call from Jensen himself, designed to sow seeds of doubt. With the affidavits and the mountain of documented evidence, Cal began to assemble his comprehensive report. It was a brutal indictment, outlining not just fraudulent billing practices and clear cases of medical malpractice, but a systematic, calculated suppression of patient grievances. He built a timeline, tracing Jensen's increasingly aggressive surgical recommendations, linking them to the inflated billing and the subsequent corporate bonuses. Knowing that official channels could be slow and easily stifled by Jensen's influence, Cal discreetly leaked parts of his findings to local investigative journalists he trusted. He provided them with enough tantalizing, verified details to pique their interest, to lay the groundwork for a public exposure that would hit harder than any lawsuit. He knew the media attention would put immense, unavoidable pressure on regulatory bodies, on the state medical board, and on the insurance companies that had, for so long, turned a blind eye. He set a date. A week from Tuesday, a formal complaint would be filed with the state medical board. Simultaneously, official notices of potential fraud and malpractice would be sent to Sterling Health and other involved insurance carriers. The quiet war was about to go public. In the midst of this controlled storm, his home life remained eerily calm, almost stagnant. He meticulously avoided direct contact with Joanne about his discoveries, about the web of deceit he was unraveling. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing day, a tangible presence in their shared space, filled with unspoken truths and the dread of what was to come. He was building Jensen's gallows, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to his core that Joanne was standing on the same trapdoor. The fallout was swift and brutal, a cascade of consequences that toppled Dr. Arthur Jensen from his pedestal. The initial media stories, fueled by the evidence I leaked, quickly snowballed into a full-blown scandal. Investigative journalists dug deeper, finding more disgruntled patients, more hushed complaints, more internal documents that corroborated my findings. The state medical board, under immense public pressure, launched an immediate and thorough investigation. Within weeks, Jensen was stripped of his medical license, his illustrious career ending not with a quiet retirement, but with public disgrace. Multiple individual lawsuits, filed by the patients I brought forward, piled onto his existing legal woes, targeting his personal assets. His reputation, once built on an illusion of medical genius, was irrevocably shattered. Westwood Medical, too, felt the impact. The revelation of systemic fraud and the suppression of patient complaints led to immense financial penalties from insurance companies and government regulators. The class action lawsuit filed by my firm on behalf of Martha, Jean, and the dozens of other victims threatened to cripple the institution financially. They settled eventually, but the damage to their standing in the community was profound. Patients left in droves, seeking care elsewhere. One cold Tuesday morning, I saw it on the local news ticker. Dr. Arthur Jensen arrested on charges of insurance fraud and medical battery. The once untouchable figure, the golden boy of Portland's medical community, was publicly disgraced, his mugshot a stark contrast to the polished portraits that once adorned hospital hallways. I watched from a distance, the satisfaction I expected mixed with a bitter taste. I had gotten my revenge, methodical and complete, but the cost, I was learning, was far higher than I had anticipated. My marriage to Joanne, already fractured, shattered completely. She was devastated, not just by Jensen's spectacular fall, but by the cold, calculated nature of my vengeance. She saw the man I had become, the man who had meticulously destroyed her affair partner's life, and by extension, hers. She saw the quiet fury, the unyielding precision with which I had acted, and it frightened her. "You said nothing, Cal," she whispered, her voice raw when she finally confronted me in the kitchen. The Hermes scarf lay crumpled on the counter between us. "You just watched, planned, while I was right here." Her eyes, once so familiar, now held a bewildered fear. "Who are you?" She couldn't reconcile the steady, dependable man she thought she knew with the relentless force who had brought down a giant. She couldn't understand the depth of the wound that had driven me, or perhaps she simply didn't want to. A week after Jensen's arrest, she left. She packed a single suitcase, leaving a short handwritten note on the bed, saying she needed time, space to understand what had happened to us, to her. I knew it was goodbye. I was left alone in our quiet Midwestern home, the silence no longer peaceful but deafening. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall was the loudest sound. I walked through the empty rooms, the ghosts of our 15 years together haunting every corner. The moral price I had paid weighed heavy on my shoulders. I had sacrificed my marriage, the comfortable peace of our family life, and perhaps a part of my own soul, all for justice and revenge. The lines between the two, once so clear in my lawyer's mind, had blurred into an indistinguishable gray. The quiet reckoning had come for everyone involved. Jensen lost everything. Westwood suffered. The patients, though vindicated, carried their physical and emotional scars. And I, the architect of it all, was left with an empty house, an empty bed, and the profound realization that some betrayals leave wounds that even the most perfect revenge can't heal. They only change their shape, morphing from sharp, sudden pain into a dull, persistent ache that would linger for the rest of my days. The silence in the house stretched, a vast, echoing space where once there had been the small sounds of a shared life. My office, once a sanctuary of logic and facts, now felt like a lonely monument to a war I had won, but at a catastrophic cost. The case files were closed, the headlines faded, but the consequences remain, etched deep into the fabric of my life. I had delivered justice, swift and uncompromising, to a man who deserved it, but the mirror showed a stranger, hardened by the pursuit. Joanne was gone, a casualty of the battle, her absence a constant, aching void. I had exacted my pound of flesh, yet found no solace in the act. The betrayal had left a permanent mark, not just on my heart, but on my very being, reshaping me into someone capable of such a calculated demolition. The quiet reckoning had come, and it had claimed us all. I was left to live with the aftermath, alone, in the profound sterilness of my own making. The fallout for Dr. Arthur Jensen was swift, a brutal unraveling of a carefully constructed life. He was stripped of his medical license, the formal letter a stark punctuation mark on his career. Multiple lawsuits from the patients Cal had brought forward piled up, each one chipping away at his finances and reputation. Within weeks, the local news, fueled by Cal's anonymous leaks, had made him a pariah. Then came the arrest, formal charges of insurance fraud and medical battery. The once untouchable figure, the city's golden boy, was publicly disgraced, his name synonymous with deceit. Westwood Medical, too, felt the impact. Financial penalties mounted, and the class action lawsuit from the dozens of victims Cal had identified loomed large, threatening to dismantle years of carefully cultivated prestige. Calvin watched it all unfold from a distance, the satisfaction he'd anticipated mixed with a bitter taste. He had achieved his revenge. Jensen was ruined. But the personal cost was a gaping wound. His marriage to Joanne was shattered beyond repair. She was devastated, not just by Jensen's fall, but by Cal's calculated, silent vengeance. The Hermes scarf, the phone messages, the systematic takedown. It all came to light, exposing not just her affair, but Cal's cold, methodical response. She couldn't reconcile the quiet, dependable man she had married with the architect of such destruction. She left him, unable to live with the man who had meticulously destroyed the life of her affair partner, and by extension, hers. Calvin was left alone in their quiet Midwestern home. The silence, once a comfort, was now deafening. He walked through rooms that once held shared laughter and mundane conversations, now echoing with emptiness. He reflected on the moral price he had paid, the sacrifice of his marriage, the peace of his family, and a part of his own soul. Justice, he realized, had a cruel twin in revenge. He sat in the living room, the evening light fading, the weight of his actions heavy on his shoulders. The quiet reckoning had come for everyone involved. He finally understood that some betrayals leave wounds so deep that even the most perfect revenge can't heal them. It could only change their shape, leaving scars that might never truly fade. The silence in the house stretched, a vast echoing space where once there had been the small sounds of a shared life. My office, once a sanctuary of logic and facts, now felt like a lonely monument to a war I had won, but at a catastrophic cost. The case files were closed, the headlines faded, but the consequences remained, etched deep into the fabric of my life. I had delivered justice, swift and uncompromising, to a man who deserved it, But the mirror showed a stranger, hardened by the pursuit. Joanne was gone, a casualty of the battle, her absence a constant, aching void. I had exacted my pound of flesh, yet found no solace in the act. The betrayal had left a permanent mark, not just on my heart, but on my very being, reshaping me into someone capable of such a calculated demolition. The quiet reckoning had come, and it had claimed us all. I was left to live with the aftermath, alone in the profound stillness of my own making. The silence in the house stretched, a vast, echoing space where once there had been the small sounds of a shared life. My office, once a sanctuary of logic and facts, now felt like a lonely monument to a war I had won, but at a catastrophic cost. The case files were closed, the headlines faded, but the consequences remained etched deep into the fabric of my life. I had delivered justice, swift and uncompromising, to a man who deserved it, but the mirror showed a stranger, hardened by the pursuit. Joanne was gone, a casualty of the battle, her absence a constant, aching void. I had exacted my pound of flesh from Arthur Jensen, yet found no solace in the act. The betrayal had left a permanent mark, not just on my heart, but on my very being, reshaping me into someone capable of such a calculated demolition. The quiet reckoning had come, and it had claimed us all. I was left to live with the aftermath, alone in the profound stillness of my own making.